The Wither. What is it? Why was it created? And when? Millions of years ago, a terrible disaster took place in the overworld, where most of the ancient people, who were the civilization that built the ancient city, were killed. The lucky few who had survived had either fled their homes or had been heavily mutated to the point where they had no idea what they were doing. However, there was one more group of survivors from that incident. Well, kind of. This final group was some of those who had actually died, but they had been resurrected through the use of dark magic, and they were the skeletons. And I'll go into more detail on that later, but for now, that's all you need to know. But, just like the regular survivors, most of the skeletons, after seeing their home in complete ruins, also decided to forever abandon them, and to just hide in the darkness forever. But that wasn't all the skeletons, as there were still many skeletons who wanted to stay and fight back the sculk that was attacking their city. After all, if they had died once and came back, who's to say they couldn't do that again? However, their attempt at attacking the sculk was a complete failure, as they were all easily defeated within a matter of seconds. But surprisingly, they weren't actually killed, because the sculk, strangely, decided to punish them instead, something that it had never done before. And that punishment was that these aggressive skeletons would be banished to the fiery dimension of the Nether. Now, the Nether was nothing like anything that these skeletons had ever experienced, as it was nothing like the peaceful overworld. As a matter of fact, the Nether was one of the most hostile places to be in the entire universe at that time, so they needed to create a plan for their survival. At first, that plan was to set up bases in the empty valleys of the Nether, but that turned out to be another horrible idea, due to the sheer number of ghasts that lived there and would constantly kill them. In fact, just a few months into their banishment, most of these skeletons were killed, with the remaining survivors once again being forced to flee their homes. And so it was then that they started to give up hope. But then they remembered something. The pigmen lived here. The pigmen had also once been an overworld creature, but they had been banished to the Nether by the ancient civilization many generations ago, which was definitely going to make interactions between the two quite tense. But regardless, it was the skeletons' only hope, as in their minds they thought that if they could find the pigmen to show them what they had become and tell them about the destructive sculk, maybe they would have mercy on them. And so they went out on a search. Only this wasn't going to be an easy search. After all, they were travelling through one of the most dangerous areas in all of existence, so it made sense that even more were killed by this deadly dimension. But those who survived pressed onwards, until one day they found them. The piglins. The piglins were once the pigmen, but they had now evolved into something more suitable for their environment. Now, when the piglins first saw the skeletons, they were obviously very skeptical. After all, this was their mortal enemy that was now begging for help. It could have easily been a trap. But once they saw how weak their powerful enemy had now become, they knew they had to do something, as ultimately the pigmen were only in the Nether after losing a century-long war to the ancient people. And so, if something was able to crush the ancient civilization so effortlessly, then that thing is definitely going to be feared by the piglins. And so, the piglins and the skeletons created an agreement. The pigmens would keep the skeletons safe from the hostile environment, but in return, the skeletons agreed to never again attack the piglins, where the punishment for doing so would be having the entire piglin species hunting them down. Also, another part of this deal was that massive fortresses would be constructed for both the pigmen and the skeletons to live in and stay safe in. But most importantly, it would be a place to attack the mysterious sculk if it was ever able to enter the Nether. And so, here's how the construction worked. The pigmen would go off and gather materials. Then, the skeletons would actually build these fortresses, as they were the only ones that had actually seen the sculk, and as such, the piglins thought that they could think of ways to counteract it. However, while building these massive fortresses, many skeletons would fall off into the fiery pits of the lava oceans. No big deal, right? Many other skeletons had died before this point, so how would this be any different? Well, it was a very big deal. Let me explain. Before the sculk banished the skeletons to the Nether, it decided to infect some of them with a dormant sculk virus. Now, that virus would only activate when the user was being damaged and was close to death. So, when the skeletons who had this virus fell in the lava, they would be taking endless amounts of fire damage. And so, it was activated. But what did this virus even do? Well, it stopped them from dying, and it gave them immunity to whatever was killing them. In this case, it gave these skeletons fire resistance. But before that effect was activated, most of their bones had been charred black from the lava. But on the plus side, they were still alive. Additionally, it gave these skeletons the Wither ability, and with that ability, the skeletons would be able to test any entity if they were infected with this sculk virus. Hence, these affected skeletons became known as the Wither skeletons. But what about those who weren't given the sculk virus? Were they given anything? Well, they were given something, but it wasn't nearly as useful as the sculk virus, as they were given a curse. A curse that would trap their souls in any nearby block when they died, and all of those blocks over time would gather together to form the soul sand and the soul soil. And by the way, that's why there are valleys of soul sand, as the valleys were where most of the skeletons were killed. But back to the Wither skeletons. They had been kept alive and were given a useful new ability. So where were the negatives of having this virus? Well, once these skeletons turned into Wither skeletons, they became a servant of the sculk, which gave them a mission that they were forced to follow. And that was to sacrifice as many other nether creatures as they possibly could to form the subscribe star. To form the soul star. The soul star was a block of compressed souls that could be used to summon the sculk in a physical form in the nether. And so they began their mission. And after months of doing so, it finally happened. The Wither skeletons had been able to form the Soul Star, and with that star, they were able to summon the sculk. But this form that the sculk was able to manifest into wasn't quite made right, and so it was more of a mutant rather than anything else. It had 3 charred skeletal heads who all acted independently of each other. It had a body made from the blocks of trapped souls. Also, it had many small arms made from souls of people trying to reach for freedom. And finally, it even had a tail for some strange reason. And so, if you haven't guessed already, that sculk manifestation, well, it was the Wither. But regardless of all these strange mutations the Wither had, it was still a very powerful creature, as it controlled all the power of the souls trapped within. And it was powered from an indestructible core, and so it rightfully believed that it had enough power to control the Nether. Or so it hoped. So this newly formed Wither rose from the depths of the lava oceans, towering over the Nether fortresses. Instantly, all the fortress inhabitants became entranced by the Wither, becoming a servant of it. But after a short while, most of the piglins came to their senses, and they realized that this must have been a form of the sculk that they had been preparing for, and so they began to attack. However, just like many previous attempts to attack the sculk or any of its incarnations, it was a futile attempt, as those who tried to attack were obliterated and were turned into useless roses. Seeing this, the remaining piglins who weren't under the influence of the Wither abandoned the fortresses, once again feeling defeated by the ancient civilization. But through that feeling of betrayal, the pigmen knew that they had to defeat the Wither, or else they would risk losing the Nether, and so they decided to create their own base of operations. These fortresses would have very thick walls to protect against Wither explosions. Also, it would be made from much more blast resistant blocks, such as blackstone. And finally, these fortresses would be much larger and provide more areas for the piglins to hide if something was to go wrong. And so that's how the Nether bastions were created. Meanwhile, back in the Nether fortresses, the rest of the Nether civilizations began worshipping the Wither, seeing it as a godlike entity, and the Wither didn't attack them. They thought that the Wither didn't attack them because they were worshipping it, but really the Wither wasn't attacking them because they were all undead mobs who didn't have a soul to steal. But regardless, the Wither saw this as a massive advantage. After all, he now had an army of somewhat powerful creatures that he could use for its own personal benefit. And so, since the Wither wanted to overthrow the Nether dimension, it needed to take out all of those who opposed it. But luckily for the Wither, there was only one group who opposed, those being the Bastion Piglins, and so the Wither ordered its followers to attack. But while they may have been able to deal massive amounts of damage to both the Bastion as well as many of the Piglins, the Wither still needed a bigger army to permanently eliminate them, and so for now the Wither was forced to retreat. But then it had a genius idea. Send some of his followers to the overworld. The plan here was that the skeletons could be used to create an endless army using the dark magic. With that dark magic, the skeletons would be able to sacrifice themselves to create spawners that could summon infinitely more skeletons. Now, that would only work in the overworld because the spell needed the caster to be in its dimension of origin. And then once the skeleton spawners had created enough skeletons, they would be transported back to the Nether and become part of the Wither's army. Sounds like a great plan. What could possibly go wrong? Everything went wrong. You see, when these select few skeletons were sent back to the overworld, they were reminded of the greatness of their past home, and many of them didn't want to give them up, and so they abandoned the Wither's army. That being said, there were still quite a number of skeletons who were motivated to serve the Wither, and so they would give up their life force to create these spawners. Except there was a slight problem. Because many of the skeletons had abandoned the Wither, there were no longer enough for the creation of all skeleton spawners, and so they were forced to use other mobs, like spiders and zombies for their spawners. But they were useless for the Wither. They couldn't be used in their battle against the piglins, and so as a consequence, the Wither would start losing its war against the piglins. And so, not too long after that, the Wither would be forced to hide in the soul sand, waiting for a new adventurer to resummon it and allow it to have a new reign over the Nether. So, although the Skulk's attempt at ruling the Nether had failed for now, its rule over the overworld was rapidly growing. Because of, well, actually, watch this video to find out.